The courthouse in Burlington, Vermont, stood like an aging monument, its sandstone walls streaked with decades of weather and whispers of stories that had passed through its doors. On that gray autumn morning, the building buzzed with quiet tension. Reporters lined the front steps, their cameras pointed toward the entrance, where a small crowd of locals huddled in scarves and coats. The wind carried faint echoes of conversation, half gossip, half grief. Inside, Courtroom 3 smelled faintly of old wood polish and coffee. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above the murmuring crowd. Every bench was filled. Neighbors, off-duty officers, journalists, and even strangers had come, drawn by the tragedy that had divided the town and captured national attention. Officer Mark Ralston, once the pride of the Burlington Police Department's K-9 unit, was about to stand trial for negligent homicide, accused of causing the car accident that claimed the life of a young mother, Emily Sanders. At precisely 9 o'clock, a side door opened and Mark walked in. He looked older than his 36 years. His dark hair, once neatly trimmed, had silvered at the temples. The crisp navy uniform he wore couldn't disguise the heaviness in his shoulders. His eyes, a dull shade of green, carried the hollow look of a man who hadn't slept in weeks. Behind him padded a German shepherd, his coat streaked with gray, his expression steady but alert. The dog's name was Rex, a hero to some, a reminder of heartbreak to others. His presence in the courtroom was controversial, but Judge Corinne Lowell had allowed it, citing his relevance to the case. As Mark took his seat beside his attorney, murmurs rippled through the room. The bailiff's voice cut through the tension. All rise. Everyone stood as the judge entered. A woman in her 50s with sharp eyes softened by years of hard cases. When she took her seat, silence fell like a curtain. "You may be seated," she said, her tone steady but kind. The shuffle of clothing and the creak of benches followed. Across the room, Ryan Sanders, the husband of the late Emily, sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table. His face was pale, his jaw tight, his hands resting on the small shoulders of his 3-year-old daughter. Lily, dressed in a pale yellow sweater with tiny flowers stitched on it, clutched a warm teddy bear in one hand. Her big blue eyes scanned the room, curious and unafraid. When she spotted Rex lying quietly near Mark's feet, her gaze lingered. She tilted her head, the way children do when something feels familiar, but just out of reach. The judge glanced at her, then back at the attorneys. "Let's begin," she said. The prosecution started by painting a picture of recklessness. Officer Ralston was driving over 90 miles per hour through a residential street. The district attorney, Linda Harrow, declared, her voice sharp but even. He had his sirens on, yes, but there was no immediate danger that justified that speed. The result of his choices, she paused, looking toward Brian, was the death of Emily Sanders, a wife, a mother, and a teacher who was simply driving home from work. She gestured toward the screen behind her, where frozen images from the dashcam footage appeared. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Even though most of them had seen it already on the evening news, it still had the power to quiet a room. The footage showed flashing lights, the curve of the wet road, and then a blur. The final frame captured the moment before impact. The haunting part wasn't the crash itself, but the faint sound that came just before it. A bark, sharp and urgent. Linda continued, "The defense will tell you that the brakes failed. That Officer Ralston had no control. But we intend to prove that this was not a mechanical failure. It was human error." She returned to her seat, satisfied. When it was time for the defense, Mark's attorney, David Lawson, stood. A calm, steady man with a silver beard and a voice that carried warmth even in tension, he began slowly. "Officer Ralston is not a reckless man," he said. "He's a decorated officer with 12 years of service, countless commendations, And one partner who saved more lives than most people in this room can imagine. He turned toward Rex, who watched him with still eyes. That partner is Rex. The dog you see sitting there was trained to detect danger, to protect, and to warn his handler. On the night of the accident, Rex barked, not in confusion, but in alarm. Something was wrong. Officer Ralston reacted to that warning, and what followed was a chain of events that even he couldn't stop. The attorney's words hung in the air. The audience leaned forward. Lily let out a small yawn, resting her head on her father's chest. Brian absently smoothed her hair, his expression unreadable. The judge nodded for the first witness to be called. The first to testify was a mechanic from the department's vehicle maintenance unit. He confirmed that the patrol car had been scheduled for a brake inspection 2 days before the crash, but the appointment had been delayed. The pads were worn, he admitted. We didn't think they'd fail, but... He trailed off, guilt flashing across his face. The prosecutor pounced. But they did fail, correct? Yes, ma'am. So, Officer Ralston was driving a vehicle he knew was unsafe? I can't say what he knew, but thank you. No further questions. When the defense took over, Lawson asked quietly, "Do you believe Officer Ralston was aware of the defect?" The mechanic hesitated. If he'd known, he wouldn't have been driving that fast. Not with Rex in the car. Exactly, Lawson said. Because Rex was his family, too. Through the long morning, the testimonies blurred together. Experts, officers, witnesses. The air grew heavy with repetition and emotion. But amid it all, there was Rex, lying silent, only occasionally lifting his head when the room's tension spiked. His calmness was unnerving. Even the judge glanced at him now and then, as if he were a living barometer of truth. At one point, the bailiff brought in a bowl of water for him. As he drank quietly, Lily watched from across the room, fascinated. She pointed once, but said nothing. Her father gently held her hand down. "Not now, sweetie," he whispered. During a recess, reporters huddled in the hallway, their voices overlapping. "Did you see the kid?" "Yeah, the little girl. Emily's daughter. She looks just like her. And that dog, that's the same one in the video, right?" "Sure is. Poor thing probably doesn't even understand what's happening." Back inside, Mark remained seated, staring at his hands. His attorney leaned over. "You holding up?" Mark nodded weakly. "I don't care what happens to me," he murmured. "I just want the truth out. I didn't mean for any of it. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time." Rex rested his chin on Mark's boot, as if sensing his pain. Across the aisle, Brian watched them. For a brief second, pity flickered in his eyes, but it was quickly swallowed by anger. He looked down at Lily, asleep now in his lap, and whispered to himself, "You're the reason she doesn't have a mother." When court resumed, the tension only deepened. The sound of the gavel echoed like thunder. "Officer Ralston," the judge said, "you may take the stand." Mark rose slowly, adjusting his uniform. Every step toward the witness chair felt heavier than the last. When he sat down, the room seemed to hold its breath. "Tell us," the prosecutor said, "what happened that night?" Mark's throat tightened. "We were pursuing a stolen vehicle. Rex detected something. Danger, maybe a chemical. He barked, hard. I slowed down, but the road was slick. I hit the brakes and..." His voice cracked. "Nothing happened. The car slid. I lost control. The next thing I remember is the sound of metal." He stopped, eyes wet. "And our car. I'll never forget that sound." The courtroom was silent. Even the judge looked down, pen motionless. Lily stirred in her father's arms, eyes half open. "Doggy," she whispered sleepily. Brian shushed her gently. not realizing those simple words were a quiet foreshadowing, a spark of truth buried in a child's memory that would later change everything. For now, though, all anyone saw was tragedy. Outside, the clouds thickened. Inside, the weight of loss hung over everyone. The trial had only just begun, but already hearts were breaking. Outside the courthouse, the October wind carried more than just fallen leaves. It carried opinions. Whispers darted between strangers, standing near the courthouse steps, voices hushed but cutting. "Did you see him in there?" One woman said, clutching her scarf. "Looks guilty to me." "You can always tell." "Don't be ridiculous," replied another. "That man served this town for years." "You think he wanted that to happen?" And so it went. Judgment traded like gossip, truth twisted by grief and loyalty. For a small Vermont town that once idolized Officer Mark Ralston, the crash had ripped a fault line right through its center. Inside, Courtroom 3 still held its quiet tension. The overhead lights glowed a harsh white, bouncing off the polished wood benches. At the defense table, Mark sat stiffly beside his attorney, David Lawson. He looked down often, avoiding the curious eyes trained on him. He could feel the weight of their stares, citizens who once smiled at him in diners or waved as he drove past in his patrol car. Now, they looked at him like he was a stranger. But Mark didn't care about the whispers. He only cared about the man sitting across the aisle, Brian Sanders. Brian was a ghost of the man he'd been a year ago. The loss of his wife, Emily, had hollowed him out. His cheeks were sunken, his eyes rimmed red but dry. In the weeks after the accident, tears had run dry. Only anger remained. He sat upright, as if holding himself together with sheer willpower. His hand rested protectively on his daughter's small back. Lily Sanders, the 3-year-old at the heart of the tragedy, swung her legs beneath the bench, humming softly to herself, unaware of the storm swirling around her. From her high bench, Judge Lowell watched everything, not just the witnesses, but the human drama beneath it. Years on the bench had taught her that truth wasn't always found in evidence. Sometimes it was in the small things, the way someone looked away too quickly, the way a child's innocence could cut through adult lies. She noticed Lily's eyes drifting again toward the German shepherd lying near Mark's feet. The dog hadn't moved much all morning, except to shift his head when people entered or left. His stillness gave him an almost regal air, like he understood every word being said. When Lily smiled at him, his tail thumped softly against the floor. The sound made a few people glance over. Even the bailiff cracked a faint smile. Judge Lowell noted it quietly. In all her years, she'd learned to trust moments like that. The prosecutor, Linda Harrow, resumed her questioning of the mechanic from earlier. "You said the car's brakes were overdue for maintenance," she pressed. "Yes, ma'am," the mechanic replied, wringing his cap in his hands. The pads were worn, and the fluid was low. "We had a note on the schedule, but it got pushed back." "And Officer Ralston was aware of this delay?" "He should have been," the man admitted. Linda nodded curtly. "So he knew he was driving a dangerous vehicle, yet he pursued a suspect at high speed anyway." "Objection," David Lawson said immediately. "Speculation. The witness doesn't know what my client knew or didn't know." "Sustained," Judge Lowell said, tapping her gavel lightly. "Rephrase, Miss Harrow." The mechanic exhaled shakily, clearly wanting to disappear. He looked toward Mark with something like pity. After his testimony ended, the prosecutor called the next witness, a civilian named Nancy Briggs, who had been driving a few cars behind Emily on the night of the crash. Nancy took the stand nervously, smoothing her skirt. "I was coming home from the grocery store," she began. "It was raining hard. I saw flashing lights behind me, so I pulled over. Then I saw Emily's car up ahead. She slowed down too. The police car came around the corner fast. Real fast. Can you estimate the speed? Linda asked. Maybe 80? 90? It was quick. I remember thinking he was going to lose control. And then, he did. Nancy swallowed hard. The car hit Emily's sedan, and everything went white. I heard metal and glass. I stopped my car and ran over, but it was too late. Her voice broke. The courtroom was silent. Even the clicking of reporters' keyboards had stopped. Mark closed his eyes. He could hear it again. That shattering sound, the bark, the rain, the silence that followed. David Lawson rose for the cross-examination. Ms. Briggs, you said it was raining? Yes. And dark? Yes. So visibility was poor. Very. And you were several cars behind? She hesitated. 2 or 3. So you couldn't see what might have caused the vehicle to lose control. Oil, debris, or mechanical failure? Nancy looked down. No, I couldn't. No further questions. The judge called for a brief recess. As the crowd filed out into the hallway, whispers immediately filled the air again. Some spoke in defense of Mark. Others condemned him. In the hallway, Brian stayed seated, Lily asleep against his chest. Her small breaths were steady, innocent. He brushed a strand of blonde hair from her forehead and looked up at the ceiling tiles. He didn't want to hate Mark, not really. But every time he thought of Emily's laugh, her voice, the way she'd sing lullabies to Lily before bed, anger surged back like a wave. Mr. Sanders, a voice said gently. He looked up. It was Detective Karen Holt, one of the few officers still willing to speak with him after the accident. I just wanted to say. She hesitated, glancing at the child in his arms. I know this is hard. But Mark, he wasn't a bad cop. He's been beating himself up over this every day. Brian's jaw tightened. That doesn't bring her back. No, she said quietly. But maybe it can help you both find peace. He didn't answer. Back in the courtroom, the afternoon session resumed. Mark took the stand once more, this time questioned by his attorney. Officer Ralston, Lawson began. How long have you worked with Rex? 7 years, Mark replied. His voice was rough but steady. And how would you describe your partnership? Closer than family, Mark said, glancing down at the dog. He saved my life twice. He's trained to react to danger, gunfire, explosives, unstable chemicals. That night, he barked before I even saw anything wrong. Lawson nodded. And what did that bark mean to you? It meant something was off. It wasn't random. Rex doesn't bark like that unless he senses a threat. I slowed down, but the road was slick. I tapped the brakes and... He paused, swallowing hard. They didn't respond. The courtroom listened in utter stillness. Even the air felt thick with unspoken emotion. Lawson stepped closer. Do you believe you did everything you could to avoid that crash? Mark hesitated, then nodded slowly. I do. But it wasn't enough. When the session ended for the day, the judge dismissed the court. People rose from their seats in silence. Mark stood too, resting his hand briefly on Rex's head. The dog looked up, eyes soft, almost human. As the crowd began to shuffle out, Lily suddenly stirred in her father's arms. She looked around sleepily, eyes landing on the dog again. This time she smiled, a tiny, curious smile that made even the tired bailiff pause. Doggy, she whispered. The sound was so small, most didn't hear it. But Rex did. His ears perked. He tilted his head toward her, tail wagging once. Brian noticed and instinctively pulled her closer, but not unkindly. He couldn't help but notice the way the dog looked at her, not with confusion or fear, but something almost familiar. For a moment, the courtroom wasn't divided by guilt or grief. It was just a quiet room where a child and a dog shared a fleeting, inexplicable connection. Outside, the sky had deepened into dusk. Reporters shouted questions. Flashes burst like lightning. Mark said nothing. He simply opened the back door of his truck and let Rex climb in. The dog turned once, gazing back toward the courthouse as if reluctant to leave. From the second-floor window, Brian watched them go. He didn't know why, but his heart ached in a different way. Not from anger this time, but from the faint, confusing feeling that there was still something he didn't understand about that night. As the wind picked up and leaves swirled through the courthouse steps, one truth hung in the air. The trial wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It was about what really happened in those few seconds before everything changed, and what a loyal dog might still remember. The next morning, the courthouse was shrouded in a cold mist that clung to the stone steps like breath held too long. The news vans had already lined the street before sunrise, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Reporters, bundled in coats and scarves, whispered into microphones as their cameramen panned toward the courthouse doors. Inside, the air was quieter but no less charged. The murmurs of the arriving crowd mixed with the soft clicking of shoes on tile. The same faces filled the benches: townspeople, police officers, journalists, and a few unfamiliar observers, drawn by the growing media attention. At the defense table, Officer Mark Ralston sat with his hands folded tightly, the knuckles pale against his dark suit. He wasn't wearing his uniform today. His lawyer had suggested the change, thinking it might make him look more human. It didn't make him feel that way. Beside him, Rex lay curled near his chair. The dog's steady breathing was the only rhythm Mark could focus on. Whenever his mind began to drift toward the night of the crash, toward the twisting metal and the sound that never stopped echoing in his skull, he looked down at Rex, at the calm, loyal eyes that had seen it all too. He wasn't alone in his guilt. Across the aisle, Brian Sanders sat with his hands clasped together, fingers trembling slightly. His wedding ring still rested on his left hand. He wore it like armor, a reminder, a protest, a wound that never quite closed. Beside him, Lily sat quietly, swinging her legs as if she were in church. Her teddy bear, worn and faded, rested in her lap. Every so often she looked around, eyes curious and searching. When her gaze landed on Rex, she smiled faintly. The dog didn't move, but his tail brushed against the floor once, a soft sound that caught the judge's eye again. Judge Karen Lowell adjusted her glasses and scanned the courtroom before speaking. "We'll continue with the defense's presentation," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "Mr. Lawson, you may call your next witness." David Lawson stood. His tone was calm, but carried weight. "Your Honor, the defense calls Officer Mark Ralston to the stand." The words hung heavy in the air. Mark rose slowly, smoothing his tie with trembling fingers. The floorboards creaked beneath his polished shoes as he approached the witness stand. Rex watched him the entire way, his ears twitching as if aware of the importance of this moment. When Mark sat down, the bailiff stepped forward to swear him in. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do," Mark said softly. The microphone picked up the faint tremor in his voice. "Please state your full name and occupation," Lawson began. "Mark Thomas Ralston. I was a canine officer with the Burlington Police Department." "Were?" Lawson repeated gently. "You've since been placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of this trial, correct?" "Yes, sir." "And how long did you serve in the department?" 12 years. "And how long have you worked with your canine partner, Rex?" Mark glanced down at the dog, whose head now rested between his paws. 7 years, he said. "He's the best partner I ever had." Lawson let a pause linger, before continuing. Let's talk about that night, Officer Ralston. November 14th, last year. Mark inhaled slowly. The courtroom seemed to fade into silence. Even the air conditioner hummed quieter. I was on patrol, he began. We got a call about a stolen vehicle, suspected of being linked to an earlier robbery. I spotted it near Route 16, a black SUV, no headlights. I radioed it in and began pursuit. Rex was in the back seat, harnessed as always. He looked toward Brian, whose face was unreadable. The road was slick from rain. I kept a safe distance. I'd done this 100 times. But then, Mark's eyes clouded. Rex barked. One sharp bark, not panic, not aggression. Just that deep alert sound he makes when something's wrong. I'd learned to trust that bark. I eased off the accelerator and started to brake, but the pedal went straight to the floor. He clenched his fists. There was no resistance. Nothing. Lawson stepped closer. So the brakes failed? Yes. And what did you do next? I tried to steer into the shoulder, but it was too late. The car began to fishtail. I saw headlights, Emily Sanders' car, coming around the bend. I tried to veer right, but the road was too narrow. The last thing I remember is the sound of Rex barking again, and the crash. Mark's voice cracked. After that, I woke up to screaming and glass everywhere. My airbag had deployed. Rex was whimpering, trying to crawl to the passenger side window. I saw her car through the rain. He stopped, pressing a hand to his face. The courtroom held its breath. Even the prosecutor looked away for a moment. After a long pause, Lawson spoke softly. Officer Ralston, did you intend to harm anyone that night? Mark shook his head. No, sir. I'd give anything to change it. And do you believe Rex's warning, his bark, gave you any chance to react? Yes, Mark whispered. If it weren't for him, I would have hit her car head on. He made me slow down, even if just for a second. Lawson turned toward the judge. Your Honor, we'd like to play the dashcam footage again. Judge Lowell nodded. Proceed. The lights dimmed as the large screen flickered to life. The familiar grainy video filled the room. The sound of wipers swishing, rain tapping on the windshield, the faint hum of the siren in the background, all of it returned like a ghost. Then, at the 23-second mark, the sharp, unmistakable bark echoed through the speakers. Some people flinched. Others wiped their eyes. That, Lawson said quietly, is Rex. He turned back to Mark. Is that the moment you realized something was wrong? Yes, Mark said. That bark saved one life that night, even if I didn't realize it then. The prosecutor, Linda Harrow, rose for cross-examination. She was composed, every movement deliberate. Officer Ralston, she began, you said you were pursuing a stolen vehicle. Were you aware that the pursuit policy advises against high-speed chases in residential areas under rainy conditions? Yes, ma'am, Mark admitted. And yet, you continued. Yes, because I believed the suspect posed a risk to others. Or because you wanted to make an arrest. Mark's jaw tightened. Because I wanted to stop someone who could have hurt others. Linda nodded, pacing slightly. You're a trained officer, are you not? I am. And you're trained to handle emergency situations? Yes. So why didn't you use the emergency brake when the primary brakes failed? Mark hesitated. I tried. The car was already sliding. Pulling it harder would have spun us out faster. The prosecutor arched a brow. But you made a choice. You kept driving, knowing the risk. Mark's voice lowered. I made a choice to try to survive. And I have to live with the outcome. The tension in the room grew thick again. Tell me, officer, Linda said softly, have you spoken to the victim's family since that night? No, he whispered. Because I didn't know what to say. She nodded. No further questions. When the judge dismissed him, Mark didn't immediately move. He sat for a moment longer, shoulders hunched, eyes on the floor. Then quietly, he rose and walked back to his seat. Rex's tail brushed the floor once as he returned, a silent reassurance. The rest of the day moved slowly. Witness testimonies, legal arguments, procedural motions, but none of it mattered. The image of Mark's trembling hands and the echo of Rex's bark stayed with everyone in that room. As the sun began to set, painting long stripes of light across the benches, Judge Lowell finally called for adjournment. People began to stand, gathering coats and notes. The low murmur of conversation filled the room again. Mark reached down, brushing his fingers against Rex's fur. "Good boy," he whispered. Rex licked his hand once, eyes calm and steady. Across the aisle, Lily stirred on the bench. She looked at the dog again, her small mouth forming a sleepy smile. "Doggy," she whispered softly. This time, her father didn't shush her. He only looked at her, really looked, and for the first time since the accident, something in his expression changed. The anger didn't vanish, but it wavered, just slightly. Because in that single innocent word, spoken by a child too young to understand grief or guilt, there was something pure, a reminder that not all truths come from adults. Some come from the quiet voices we least expect. Outside, the mist had lifted. The courthouse lights glowed warm against the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new witnesses, new arguments, and new revelations. But tonight, as Mark drove home with Rex, resting his head on the passenger seat, one thought echoed in his mind: the sound of that bark, the child's voice, and the memory of a moment he couldn't yet explain. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall courthouse windows like soft ribbons of gold, catching dust motes that swirled gently in the air. The storm from the previous night had passed, leaving the world washed clean, the streets outside still glistening. Inside, however, the weight of grief and justice lingered thick in the air. For days, the trial had been a battlefield of quiet pain, legal jargon wrapped around raw human emotion. But that morning felt different. There was a hush, a kind of fragile calm, as if the air itself sensed something waiting to happen. Brian Sanders held Lily's small hand as they walked up the courthouse steps. His movements were slow, deliberate. He hadn't slept much. His mind had replayed every second of Mark's testimony again and again. He hated the man, but for the first time, he wasn't sure if his hate still had a direction. It had started to crumble under the weight of exhaustion and truth. He glanced down at Lily, who wore a yellow dress with tiny white daisies stitched along the hem. She clutched her teddy bear in one hand, his other hand in hers. Her blue eyes were wide with curiosity, not fear. "Are we seeing the doggy again, Daddy?" she asked. Brian hesitated, his throat tightening. "Maybe, sweetheart. But remember, you have to be quiet, okay? Like a mouse." She nodded solemnly. "Like a mouse." He smiled faintly, the first genuine smile he'd managed in weeks. Inside the courtroom, Officer Mark Ralston sat at the defense table, staring down at the polished wood surface, as if answers were carved there. He hadn't seen Brian or Lily enter. His mind was tangled with memories of the crash, the investigations, and the faces that judged him every time he walked into town. Rex sat beside him, calm as ever, eyes scanning the room with the steady awareness only service dogs seemed to possess. The air seemed to shift whenever the child entered, though, something Rex sensed before anyone else. When Lily and Brian took their seats, Rex lifted his head. His ears twitched. His gaze found her instantly. Lily smiled, a simple, bright smile that reached her eyes. She waved once, small fingers fluttering like a bird's wings. "Doggy." she whispered before Brian could stop her. Judge Lowell looked up sharply from her notes, but the sound had been too innocent to interrupt. Rex's tail gave a quiet thump against the floor, and for one fleeting second, every person in the courtroom, lawyers, witnesses, jurors, felt the strange warmth of that simple, wordless moment. The morning session began. The prosecution called their expert witness, a traffic reconstruction analyst. Charts were displayed, angles and distances debated, brake pressure and road gradients discussed. It was dry, mechanical, sterile, a necessary part of justice, but it drained the air of emotion. Only Lily seemed untouched by the monotony. Her gaze kept drifting toward Rex, who lay patiently near the witness stand. She watched the rise and fall of his breathing, the way his ears twitched whenever someone spoke too loudly. She didn't see a police dog. She saw comfort, something safe and kind that reminded her of bedtime stories and gentle warmth. At one point, as the prosecutor droned on about tire impressions, Rex lifted his head again. His gaze met Lily's once more. This time, she didn't just smile. She mouthed something soundless but clear. "Good boy." Rex blinked slowly. Then, as if understanding, his tail tapped the floor twice. The tiny sound carried across the courtroom, unnoticed by most, but Mark heard it. His eyes flicked toward Rex, following the dog's line of sight until they landed on Lily. The child didn't look away. Something in Mark's chest shifted, something small and painful, and strangely relieving. When the recess bell finally rang, chaos followed. Lawyers gathering papers, journalists rushing to send updates, the judge retreating to chambers. Brian began packing Lily's coloring book when he noticed movement near the defense table. Mark was kneeling beside Rex, attaching the service leash to the dog's harness. Their eyes met for the first time. It wasn't planned. Neither man had wanted it. But there it was, raw, unfiltered, heavy. Mark hesitated, then took a small step forward. "Mr. Sanders," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. Brian stiffened, jaw tight. "Officer." They stood there for a moment, the silence between them thick as fog. Then a soft voice broke through it. "Can I pet the doggy?" Lily asked, tugging on her father's sleeve. Brian opened his mouth, to refuse, to end this before it began, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the look in Mark's eyes. Not defensive, not pleading, just tired, human. Mark glanced at the judge's clerk nearby. "He's trained," he said gently. "He won't move unless I tell him. But if it's all right with you." Brian's throat worked. He nodded once. "Okay, just for a minute." Mark lowered to one knee beside Rex. "Gentle, okay?" he told Lily softly. She nodded eagerly, stepping closer on her little shoes that squeaked faintly against the tile. Rex stayed perfectly still as her small hand brushed his fur. She giggled, a sound so pure and spontaneous it cut straight through the room's tension like sunlight breaking clouds. "He's soft," she said, grinning. "And warm." Mark managed a small smile. "He likes you." Brian watched silently, his heart tightening in his chest. He hadn't seen his daughter this happy in months, not since before the accident, before the nights she woke crying for her mother. Lily leaned closer, whispering something only Rex could hear. The dog tilted his head slightly, then gave her a soft lick on the wrist. Everyone nearby smiled without meaning to, even the bailiff. For a few brief minutes, the courthouse wasn't a place of grief or guilt. It was just a quiet room where a little girl and a loyal dog shared something innocent. When the recess ended, the judge returned, and the next witness was called. But something had changed. Everyone felt it. Even Linda Harrow, the prosecutor, seemed more subdued as she questioned the next witness. The sharp edges of hostility had softened slightly, replaced by something closer to compassion. Brian sat silently, one arm around Lily as she colored in her book again. Her drawings were simple: flowers, a house, a stick figure family. But in the corner of the page, she'd drawn something new: a brown dog with a wagging tail beside a smiling girl. When Brian noticed, his breath caught. He hadn't seen her draw her mother in weeks, but there, next to the dog, was a tall figure with long hair and a dress, holding the girl's hand. Something inside him cracked open. He realized what this moment meant to her and to him. That maybe forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. Maybe it was about finding light in the ruins. By the time court adjourned that day, word of the small interaction had already spread. A local reporter had caught a brief clip, Lily petting the police dog, her laughter echoing faintly in the marble halls. That night, the clip aired on local news with a simple headline: "Victim's daughter comforts police dog at emotional trial." The image spread quickly. Viewers didn't see sides. They saw a story of two families tied together by tragedy, and a dog who somehow bridged the gap. At home, Mark watched the clip in silence. Rex lay at his feet, tail gently sweeping the floor. He reached down, fingers brushing the dog's fur. "She's got her mother's heart," he whispered, not even realizing what he was saying. Across town, Ryan sat on the couch, Lily asleep in his lap, the same footage flickering on their television. He didn't change the channel. For the first time, he let himself watch, not out of anger, but out of something quieter: understanding. The story wasn't over. The verdict still loomed, and truth still had to be spoken. But something had shifted irreversibly, not in the courtroom, but in the hearts of those who carried the weight of that night. Because sometimes, healing doesn't begin with words or laws or justice. Sometimes it begins with a child reaching out, and a dog who simply stays. The next morning dawned clear and cold. The courthouse clock struck 9, its bell echoing through the crisp air outside as crowds began to gather once again. Reporters, who only days earlier had been feeding on tension and outrage, now spoke in softer tones. Something had shifted, not just in the case, but in the air itself. The image of a little girl petting a police dog in the middle of a courtroom had captured hearts far beyond the town of Burlington. The clip had gone viral overnight, spreading across social media platforms, filling comment sections with words like hope, forgiveness, and healing. But inside the courthouse, none of that noise mattered. What mattered now was the truth. And for the first time since the trial began, everyone seemed ready to listen. Officer Mark Ralston arrived early. He'd barely slept. The lines beneath his eyes had deepened, but his posture was straighter, his movements more composed. Something about yesterday, that small, fleeting moment when Lily's hand had rested on Rex's fur, had done what months of therapy, apologies, and isolation could not. It reminded him that maybe, just maybe, forgiveness wasn't a fantasy. He crouched beside Rex before entering the courtroom, rubbing the dog's neck gently. "You did good yesterday, buddy," he whispered. Rex leaned into the touch, his warm eyes calm and understanding. When they entered, a few people nodded to Mark, the same people who, a week earlier, had avoided even meeting his gaze. It was subtle, but real. Across the aisle, Ryan Sanders sat with Lily again. She was coloring, her little feet swinging beneath the bench. Her drawing today showed a big brown dog standing between two stick figures, one tall, one shorter, both smiling. When Brian asked who they were, she said simply, "That's me and Daddy." "And Rex?" He swallowed hard, nodding. "That's beautiful, sweetheart." And though he tried to hide it, his voice cracked on the last word. The bailiff called for order as the judge entered. "All rise." Everyone stood. The atmosphere was respectful, even reverent. When they sat again, Judge Lowell adjusted her papers and said, We'll resume with the continuation of the defense case. Mr. Lawson, you may proceed. David Lawson stood, his suit pressed, his expression measured but earnest. Your Honor, the defense would like to recall Officer Ralston to the stand for further clarification. A murmur went through the courtroom. The judge nodded. Proceed. Mark took the stand once more. This time, he seemed steadier. Not defiant, not broken, but resolved. Lawson approached. Officer Ralston, yesterday we reviewed your dashcam footage and testimony regarding the brake failure. Since then, new forensic analysis has been completed by an independent expert. Are you aware of that report? Yes, sir, Mark replied. And can you explain what it found? Mark took a deep breath. They found that the brake line in my cruiser wasn't just worn out, it had been cut. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. Lawson continued calmly. Cut, meaning intentionally damaged? Yes, Mark said. His voice was quiet but clear. The expert confirmed the line was severed cleanly with a sharp tool, not corrosion, not an accident. The murmurs grew louder until Judge Lowell banged her gavel once. Order in the court. Lawson nodded toward the clerk, who brought up a series of photographs. These images, he said, were taken from the vehicle inspection. You can see the clean incision marks along the brake tube, identical to a knife cut. Mark looked at them only briefly before turning his gaze downward. Officer Ralston, Lawson said softly, when was your patrol car last serviced? 2 days before the crash. And who had access to the vehicle between then and the night of the accident? Mark hesitated. Most of the department. We share the garage. Lawson nodded. Including anyone involved in the investigation of the robbery suspect you pursued that night? Yes. So, there is a possibility, Lawson said carefully, that the brake failure which led to the crash was not mechanical, but intentional. Mark closed his eyes for a brief moment. That's what it looks like. The courtroom erupted again. Journalists scribbled furiously. Brian's head snapped toward Mark, disbelief flashing across his face. Judge Lowell called for quiet once more. Mr. Lawson, please continue. Yes, Your Honor. Lawson turned back to Mark. Did you have any known conflicts within the department, or with anyone connected to the stolen vehicle case? Mark's throat tightened. I had a disagreement with another officer, a man named Jeff Collins. He wanted to go undercover on the robbery case. I refused to sign off because I thought it was unsafe. He didn't take it well. Lawson nodded slowly. Was Officer Collins on duty the night of the crash? Mark hesitated. Yes. And where was he assigned? The motor pool, Mark said quietly. The garage. A heavy silence filled the room. The prosecutor, Linda Harrow, rose for cross-examination. Her voice was calm but uncertain. Officer Ralston, this is a serious allegation. Do you have any direct evidence that Officer Collins tampered with your vehicle? No, Mark admitted. But he had motive, access, and he knew my route that night. Linda paced slowly. You understand this could shift the narrative of the entire case. I do, yet you didn't mention this possibility before. Mark's eyes darkened. Because I didn't know, and I didn't want to believe that one of my own could have done something like that. Linda studied him for a long moment before nodding. No further questions. When the judge called for recess, the tension was palpable. Reporters scrambled out into the hallway to make their calls, while the jurors whispered quietly to one another. In the back, Brian sat frozen. The information felt heavy, almost dizzying. For months, he had lived with one story, the simple, painful belief that a reckless officer had cost him his wife. Now, that story was cracking apart, revealing something more complex, more human, more tragic. He rubbed his temples, trying to process it all. Lily tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy?" He looked down. She pointed toward Rex again. "Doggy's sad." Brian followed her gaze. Rex lay at Mark's feet, head resting on his paws. His brown eyes looked distant, like he could sense the weight his partner carried. "Yeah," Brian said quietly. "Maybe he is." That afternoon, when the trial resumed, a new witness was unexpectedly called, a young officer from the Burlington PD. His hands shook slightly as he took the oath. His name was Evan Ruiz. He worked in the motor pool under Collins. And within minutes of questioning, the entire courtroom learned that Ruiz had overheard something weeks before the crash. Collins ranting about teaching Ralston a lesson for embarrassing him. Ruiz hadn't thought much of it then, but when he saw the footage of the crash on the news, guilt gnawed at him ever since. When he finished his testimony, you could hear a pin drop. The prosecutor, pale-faced, asked for time to verify the claim. The judge granted it, but everyone in that room knew the truth had begun to surface. When court adjourned for the day, Brian lingered. He watched Mark pack his briefcase, slow and quiet. For the first time, he saw the man not as the officer who'd taken everything from him, but as another victim of the same cruel night. He didn't approach, not yet. He wasn't ready. But he didn't turn away either. As Mark clipped Rex's leash, Lily called softly from across the aisle, "Bye, doggy." Rex looked up and wagged his tail once, low and gentle. Mark smiled faintly and raised a hand in a small wave, hesitant, respectful. Brian said nothing, but he nodded, just once. It was a fragile gesture, but it carried more weight than words. Outside, cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. Neither man answered, but both of them, in their own way, felt something beginning to heal. Because the truth, real, painful human truth, had finally begun to unfold. The courthouse the next morning felt different, heavier, as if the building itself knew that something momentous was about to unfold. The bright autumn sunlight did little to cut through the thick tension hanging over every bench, every whispered conversation. Outside, the crowd had doubled. News trucks lined the street, reporters standing shoulder to shoulder, their voices overlapping in a sea of static and speculation. Headlines flashed across screens. Officers' brakes found sabotaged. New twist in tragic Burlington trial. Inside, the mood was a fragile balance between hope and disbelief. Mark Ralston sat quietly beside Rex, one hand absently resting on the dog's back. He hadn't spoken to anyone that morning except his attorney. His heart pounded, not from fear of the verdict anymore, but from what was coming next, a part of the truth that could change everything. Across the aisle, Brian Sanders sat with Lily in his lap, her head resting against his chest. She was sleepy, her small hand clutching her teddy bear, unaware that the world around her teetered on the edge of revelation. Brian felt torn between the anger that had driven him for months and the quiet empathy that had begun to seep into his heart. Every testimony, every new piece of evidence, had chipped away at the image of Mark as the reckless monster he once believed him to be. Now, he wasn't sure what to believe. When Judge Lowell entered, the murmurs died instantly. "All rise." The courtroom stood as she took her seat, her expression composed but serious. "Before we resume," she began, "I have been informed that Officer Jeff Collins, previously mentioned during testimony, has agreed to appear voluntarily before this court. He is currently being brought in for questioning." A wave of whispers swept the room. Mark exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around Rex's leash. He'd known this moment was coming, the confrontation he never wanted but couldn't avoid. When Collins entered a few minutes later, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. He was tall, broad-shouldered, still wearing his uniform despite being placed on leave. His jaw was tight, his eyes hard, the kind of look that came from years of resentment bottled under discipline. He walked past Mark without a glance, but Rex's reaction said everything. The dog's head lifted, a low rumble deep in his chest. Not a bark, not yet, but a sound that made a few people shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Easy, boy," Mark murmured, resting a calming hand on Rex's shoulder. Collins took the stand. The oath was read, and he responded flatly, "I do." The prosecutor, Linda Harrow, approached first. "Officer Collins, you're aware that new forensic evidence indicates Officer Ralston's patrol car was tampered with prior to the crash, correct?" Collins nodded once. "Yes. And you worked in the motor pool that week?" "I did." Linda's tone was measured, almost too calm. "Did you personally service Officer Ralston's vehicle?" Collins hesitated. "I inspected it." "Routine check." "Routine?" She repeated. "No one else handled it afterward?" "Not that I recall." Linda held up a report. "The inspection log lists your initials next to the brake system entry. Can you explain why the maintenance note reads, quote, adjustment performed manually?" He swallowed. "It's standard notation." "Except," Linda said quietly, "the mechanic who trained you testified that adjustment performed manually is shorthand for temporary disconnection." The room went still. Collins shifted in his seat. "That's not true." Linda's eyes narrowed. "Officer Collins, we have a sworn statement from Officer Evan Ruiz, who worked under you. He claims he overheard you express hostility toward Officer Ralston, specifically that you wanted to teach him a lesson after he refused to approve your undercover request. Did you say that?" Collins' jaw tightened. "It was a joke." Linda's voice sharpened. "Was cutting a man's brakes a joke too?" A murmur rippled across the benches. The judge raised her gavel. "Order." Linda stepped closer to the witness stand. "Officer Collins, this court needs to know. Did you sabotage that vehicle?" Collins stared straight ahead, unmoving. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Then finally he spoke. "I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt." Gasps erupted. Even Linda froze for a moment. "Are you saying you did tamper with the car?" His voice broke slightly. "I loosened the line, okay? Just enough to make him panic on patrol. I figured he'd pull over, call for backup, maybe get a scare. I didn't think..." He stopped, his voice cracking. "I didn't think it'd lead to a crash." The courtroom exploded in noise, gasps, shouts, even cries. Judge Lowell slammed her gavel repeatedly. "Order! Order in the court!" But it was too late. The truth had landed like a thunderclap. Mark sat frozen, staring at Collins with a mix of disbelief and fury. His breath came in short bursts, his knuckles white around Rex's leash. Across the aisle, Brian had gone pale. The man he'd hated, the man he'd blamed for destroying his life, had never even been in control of the car. It had been someone else. Someone careless. Someone vindictive. Someone human. Lily stirred in his arms, sensing his trembling. "Daddy?" she whispered. He swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "It's okay, sweetheart. It's okay." But his voice was shaking. The prosecutor, regaining her composure, continued. "Officer Collins, are you aware that your actions caused the death of Emily Sanders?" Collins' head dropped. "I never meant." "Answer the question." "Yes," he whispered. "I know. And do you understand that you not only destroyed two families, but framed an innocent man in the process?" Tears welled in his eyes. "I wasn't thinking. I was angry. He always made me feel small, like I didn't belong there. I just wanted him to get a scare, to know what it felt like to be powerless for once." Mark closed his eyes. The words hit like stones. Linda turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the state moves to Dismiss the charges against Officer Ralston, effective immediately, and requests a separate criminal investigation into Officer Collins. Conduct. Judge Lowell's gavel struck the bench. Motion granted. The sound echoed through the courtroom like the breaking of chains. Mark's lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, but Mark didn't react. He sat motionless, staring at nothing, Rex pressing his head gently against Mark's knee as if to remind him to breathe. When the judge adjourned for the day, people began standing, slowly, quietly, unsure what to do or say. Reporters whispered urgently into phones, the sound of rapid typing filling the air. Brian stood too, still holding Lily. He looked across the aisle at Mark. For a moment, neither man moved. Then, without really thinking, Brian took a step forward. "Officer Ralston," he said softly. Mark turned, eyes rimmed red. Brian swallowed. "I don't know how to process all this. But I'm sorry." Mark blinked. "You're sorry?" "For hating you," Brian said. "For wanting you to suffer. I thought I knew what happened. I didn't. And I'm sorry for all the things I said." Mark's throat worked, but no words came. He finally managed. "You had every right to hate me." Brian shook his head slowly. "Maybe, but hate doesn't bring her back. And I think maybe she wouldn't want me to carry it anymore." For a long moment, the two men just stood there, broken pieces of the same tragedy, neither forgiving completely, neither forgetting, but both beginning to let go. Then a soft voice cut through the silence. "Dottie." Lily had wriggled out of her father's arms and run straight toward Rex, wrapping her small arms around the dog's neck. Rex froze for a second, then relaxed, licking her cheek gently. The entire courtroom seemed to exhale all at once. Mark smiled through the tears he hadn't realized were falling. Brian smiled too, a fragile, trembling smile that felt like sunlight after years of rain. The moment stretched, pure and wordless, because in that instant, justice and forgiveness stood side by side, not as opposites, but as survivors. Outside, the news cameras caught none of it. The world would see headlines, confessions, and press conferences. But the real story, the quiet one, the human one, belonged only to the few inside that room. A child's hug, a dog's calm eyes, and two men learning, painfully, that even the darkest nights can end with dawn. The verdict may have been delivered, but the echoes of that day didn't fade easily. For weeks after Officer Jeff Collins' confession, the small Vermont town of Burlington was draped in a strange silence, the kind that lingers after a storm has passed, when everything looks calm, but the ground is still wet, the air still heavy. On the courthouse steps, people still gathered, trading hushed words about what had happened. "Can you believe it?" they'd murmur. All that time, and he was innocent. Others spoke Mark's name with shame, realizing how quickly they'd turned against him when the story first broke. The newspapers ran the story for days. Sabotage in the squad. Officer cleared after shocking confession. News anchors replayed courtroom footage. The image of Mark's stunned face becoming a symbol of both tragedy and endurance. But for the people directly involved, the world didn't stop for headlines. It simply moved on quietly. Mark Ralston spent his first day as a free man, not at home, not celebrating, but sitting on the edge of a lake outside town, the same lake he used to jog past every morning before the crash. Rex lay beside him, his dark eyes tracking the ripples across the water. For the first time in months, Mark wasn't wearing a uniform or a prison jumpsuit. Just jeans, a gray sweatshirt, and a weariness that seemed stitched into his bones. He took a slow breath. The air smelled of pine and cold earth, of something real. He reached down and scratched Rex's neck. "We made it, boy," he said softly. Rex looked up, tail thumping once against the grass. But Mark's words didn't carry celebration. They carried disbelief, the stunned realization that he was alive, that somehow, after everything, the truth had found him again. And yet, the truth wasn't enough to erase the loss. Emily Sanders was still gone. A child was still growing up without her mother. And Mark, no matter what any court decided, would carry that weight forever. That afternoon, a soft knock came at his door. When he opened it, Brian Sanders stood there, holding a small cardboard box. They hadn't spoken since that day in court. The silence between them was thick, but not hostile, just heavy, uncertain. "Hey," Brian said quietly. "Hey," Mark replied. "I thought I'd bring this by," Brian said, lifting the box. It's from Emily's things. There's something I think you should have." Mark hesitated, unsure whether to take it. "You don't have to." "I know," Brian interrupted gently. "But I want to." Mark took the box and stepped aside. "You want to come in?" Brian nodded, and for the first time, the two men sat across from each other without a courtroom between them. The box sat unopened on the table for a long moment. Neither seemed to know how to begin. Brian was the first to speak. "She volunteered at the police department sometimes. Brought coffee and donuts when you guys were on double shifts. Said you were always polite, even when you looked exhausted." Mark's lips curved slightly. "She had a way of making bad days better." Brian nodded, eyes distant. "Yeah, she did." After a pause, Mark asked quietly, "How's Lily doing?" "She asks about you," Brian said. "About the dog, mostly, but I think she remembers you." Mark smiled faintly. "Rex misses her too." They both chuckled, softly, awkwardly, but it felt good. Like breathing again after months underwater. Finally, Brian gestured toward the box. "Go ahead. Open it." Mark lifted the lid. Inside were small keepsakes. A folded newspaper clipping, a photo, a child's drawing of a stick-figure family with a brown dog scribbled beside them. And at the bottom, a single handwritten note. Mark unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was neat, familiar. "To Officer Ralston, thank you for helping keep our town safe. I hope you never lose faith in what you do. The world needs people like you." Emily Sanders' Mark stared at the words until they blurred. He swallowed hard, voice breaking. "She wrote this?" Brian nodded. "She gave it to me to drop off at the station last year. I found it again after the accident. I didn't know when, or if I'd ever be able to give it to you." Mark set the note down carefully, as though afraid it might shatter. He couldn't speak. He could only nod. Brian leaned back, staring at the lake through the window. "You know, I used to think forgiveness meant forgetting. Pretending like none of it happened." He shook his head slowly. "But now I think it's just learning to live with what you can't change." Mark met his gaze. "That's harder than it sounds." Brian gave a sad smile. "Yeah, but maybe we can both try." For the first time, Mark believed him. In the weeks that followed, life began to edge toward something resembling normal. The police department released a public statement, honoring Mark for his service and formally apologizing for the wrongful accusations. The town held a small vigil for Emily Sanders, not to reopen wounds, but to let them finally start healing. At the vigil, candles flickered in the crisp night air, their flames swaying in unison. People spoke softly, some weeping, some holding hands. Mark stood near the back, hat in hand, listening. When Brian took the microphone, the crowd hushed. "My wife believed in kindness," he said, his voice clear. "She believed that forgiveness wasn't weakness. It was courage. And I think she'd want me to stand here tonight, not as a victim, but as someone learning to forgive." He looked at Mark in the crowd. Their eyes met briefly, and Brian gave a small nod. Mark nodded back, unable to speak. Later, after most people had gone, Lily toddled up to him, holding a candle that had burned down to a stub. "Mr. Mark?" she said, peering up at him. He knelt down. "Hey there, Lily. Mommy liked dogs," she said. "I think she'd like yours." Mark smiled, tears brimming. "I think so too." She reached out and patted Rex's head, giggling when the dog licked her hand. Brian watched from a distance, his heart heavy and light all at once. The past would always be there, a scar, not a wound. But seeing his daughter smile again, hearing her laugh without fear, it felt like the world was finally righting itself, one small piece at a time. That night, Mark sat by the lake again, watching the reflection of the moon shimmer across the dark surface. He took out Emily's note and read it once more under the silver light. "The world needs people like you." He folded it carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Rex lay beside him, sighing contentedly, his fur brushing against Mark's arm. For a long time, neither of them moved. Finally, Mark whispered, "We'll keep going, buddy. For her. For all of them." The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of pine and the faint echo of laughter from the town below. And as the night deepened, the lake grew still, reflecting a world finally learning how to heal. 5 years later, the town of Burlington looked almost exactly the same. The red brick courthouse, the rows of maple trees that blazed golden in the fall, the quiet rhythm of life that never fully forgot but had learned slowly to move forward. Time, as it always does, hadn't erased what happened, but it had softened the edges, turning pain into memory, anger into understanding, and tragedy into something quietly sacred. On a crisp October morning, Mark Ralston stood in front of the newly renovated town park, his hands tucked in his jacket pockets. A bronze statue had just been unveiled, not of a person, but of a German shepherd. The plaque at its base read, "Rex, loyal protector, silent witness, and a friend to all, in honor of the truth that heals and the courage that endures." Mark smiled faintly, running his hand along the smooth metal surface. The town had come together to fund the memorial a year earlier. Police, citizens, even school children who'd heard the story of the brave dog who never stopped believing. It had taken him a long time to come back here without feeling the ache of guilt or the sting of loss. But standing there now, the autumn air filling his lungs, Mark felt something new, peace. "Dad!" a voice called from across the park. Mark turned, smiling as his teenage daughter, Ellie, ran up to him. She wasn't his by blood, she was his by heart. 2 years ago, he'd married a woman named Claire, a nurse who had treated him during his recovery. Claire came with Ellie, who had immediately decided that Rex was her favorite creature in the universe. "Hey, kiddo," he said as she skidded to a stop beside him. "You're late." "I was getting donuts," she protested, holding up a paper bag. "Rex deserves one too." At the sound of his name, the aging shepherd perked up from his resting spot near the statue, tail wagging slowly. His muzzle had gone white with age, but his eyes were still sharp, still filled with that quiet loyalty that had carried both of them through darker days. Ellie knelt and offered him a small piece of donut. "You're the best boy. You know that?" Rex ate delicately, tail thumping against the grass. Mark laughed. "He's going to expect that every morning now." "That's fine," Ellie said. "He's a hero." Mark looked down at the old dog, his chest tightening with love and gratitude. "Yeah," he murmured. "He really is." After a while, they left the park and walked toward the community center, where the town was holding its annual fall festival, the same event Emily Sanders had helped organize years ago. Mark hadn't missed a single one since the day of the confession. It wasn't about duty or publicity anymore. It was about remembrance. Every year, the festival included a short ceremony to honor first responders and the families who had lost someone in the line of service. And every year, Brian Sanders spoke first. When they arrived, the field was full of laughter, children chasing each other, music from a small brass band drifting through the cool air, the smell of caramel apples and roasted corn everywhere. Near the stage, Brian was already there, setting up the microphone. Lily stood beside him, now 8 years old, holding a basket of yellow roses. When she spotted Mark, her face lit up. "Mr. Mark, Mr. Mark," she cried, running over with a grin that could melt steel. Mark bent down, catching her in a hug. "Hey, superstar," he said. "You've gotten taller." "I'm almost 9, she said proudly. Rex trotted up behind him, and Lily immediately crouched to wrap her arms around the dog's neck. "Hi, Rexy. I brought you flowers again." Rex licked her cheek, earning a laugh that made everyone nearby turn and smile. The ceremony began as the afternoon sun dipped low, bathing the crowd in golden light. Brian stepped to the microphone, his voice calm but warm. "Every year, we come together to remember, not just the lives we lost, but the lessons we learned," he began. "Forgiveness, courage, love. They're all the same language, really. The language that keeps us human." He glanced toward Mark. Their eyes met, not with sorrow anymore, but with quiet friendship. Brian continued, "There was a time when I thought forgiveness was impossible. But someone once showed me that it's not about forgetting. It's about choosing not to. Let pain have the last word." He gestured toward Lily, "And it's about giving the next generation something better to hold on to." Lily stepped forward and placed a single rose on the small memorial table beside the stage, one for her mother, one for every name engraved there. The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Mark felt his chest tighten. He reached down and rested his hand on Rex's head, grounding himself in the moment. For so long, he had lived under the shadow of that night, the headlights, the crash, the screaming guilt that had haunted his every breath. But now, standing there, surrounded by laughter, music, and the living proof that life could go on, he realized something profound. He had been forgiven, not just by the court or the town, or even by Brian, but by himself. After the ceremony, people mingled, old friends, neighbors, officers, teachers. Mark found himself standing beside Brian near the cider stand. "Good speech," Mark said. Brian smiled. "I practiced. Didn't want to cry this time? You still almost did." Brian chuckled. "Yeah, well, some things never change." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their daughters play with Rex, who was patiently enduring being crowned with flower garlands by a group of giggling children. "Funny, isn't it?" Brian said. "How life finds a way to mend what we break." Mark nodded. "Yeah, it is." After a pause, he added, "I think Emily would have liked this." Brian looked at him, eyes soft. "I know she would have." They both turned back toward the crowd, two men who had once stood on opposite sides of a courtroom, now standing side by side in the warm light of forgiveness. As the evening faded and the festival lights began to twinkle, Mark walked home with Rex by his side. The old dog moved slower now, but his steps were steady. They passed the courthouse, quiet and solemn under the stars. For a moment, Mark stopped, looking up at its windows, remembering the shouts, the tears, the moment Lily had hugged Rex, and the room had collectively exhaled. He smiled softly. That was the day everything had changed. The day truth broke through silence. The day a town learned compassion. The day a small girl reminded everyone what love really looked like. Mark reached down and rubbed Rex's ear. "We did good, didn't we, boy?" Rex wagged his tail, letting out a soft bark that echoed faintly in the night. Mark looked up at the sky, a deep indigo canvas sprinkled with stars, and felt something settle in his heart. Not happiness exactly, but peace. A peace that came from knowing that the worst moment of his life had somehow led to something beautiful. A community healed, a friendship born, and a little girl growing up surrounded by love. The next morning, when the sun rose over Burlington, the park glowed in its light. Dew sparkled on the bronze statue of Rex, and a fresh yellow rose lay at its base. No one saw who placed it there. Maybe it was Lily on her way to school. Maybe Brian passing by. Or maybe, in some unseen way, it was Emily herself, leaving one last thank you for the people who had carried her memory forward. The wind stirred, rustling the leaves, and for a brief, golden moment, it almost sounded like laughter. And somewhere beneath the rising sun, a little girl pointed at the statue and whispered to her father, "Look, Daddy, that's the dog who made everyone friends again." Brian smiled, lifting her into his arms. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said softly. "That's the one." And as they walked away, the town carried on, forever changed by a tragedy that became a lesson, and a lesson that became a story of love stronger than loss. Because sometimes the smallest hearts, a child's, a dog's, hold the greatest power to heal them all.